So I'm Sean Coughlin with Cloudian, and I was asked to come and address the audience today in regards to 5 ways that object storage can help machine learning. So I'm going to kind of run through a few ways and then kind of talk a little bit more about each one of these. But first and foremost, object storage and Cloudian provides a single global namespace in a peer-to-peer network that's globally distributed. We also provide an extremely low-cost platform. Typically, I tell customers that if you're going to look at a data set, your machine learning algorithms are only going to be as good as the amount of data that you actually store against those algorithms, right? So the lower the cost the storage, the more that you'll be able to analyze, right? And that's kind of what we help in a big way, and I'll talk more about that. Also, we provide an on-premises private cloud storage, right? So I tell customers if your data is originating inside your premise, well, then you need a storage system that captures that locally and then might be able to distribute or tier the data out to the cloud if you need to kind of spin up lots of CPU in the cloud. And that's kind of what Cloudian provides, is this hybrid approach to storing data. And today we just announced with Microsoft Azure, we're the first object storage system that natively supports the S3 API that can tier directly to Azure and the Azure stack in the cloud. That goes along with for the last year or two, we've been tiering data to AWS, S3 buckets, as well as to the Google Cloud. What I actually talk a lot and work with a lot of banks as well as federal government agencies, and part of the mandate by a lot of infrastructure teams is around security of data storage. And Cloudian and our instantiation of object storage allows for deep integration with AES 256-bit encryption, as well as integration with access controls, including LDAP and Active Directory. So we give you kind of the ability to control and make sure that your data is safe all the time. And especially it's inside your firewall, not in the public cloud. So there's a lot more data control. And lastly, the S3 API support. So our API is the S3 API. So we're the only object storage vendor that natively supports the S3 API, including all of its verbs. So you don't have to change your application that you may have built to model out in the public cloud. You can bring that in-house and be able to utilize all the tools and all the aspects of the verbs that you would get in the public cloud, but you could do that through the API on your premise. So just talking through what is object storage, for those that don't know. Very simply, we take through the API a URL address, right? It's a web service API, and we hash that API, and that essentially is the naming convention, right, with a bucket name and an object name at the application level of where the data is going to be stored on disk. And so we hash that and we distribute that in a Cassandra NoSQL database so that we understand securely across a cluster, potentially geographically dispersed, where that data is all the time, so it can be retrieved back to the application, right? So as opposed to traditional storage where it's NAS or CIFS NFS or block storage, where the applications either see a file system, a directory structure, or a block protocol. In this case, the applications are utilizing a web service API, right? It's a URL address. So we have a policy-based system. So again, we can distribute the data globally, and you set the policies for how you go and do this. So we can do things in a single site, just kind of like Amazon has kind of like a single availability zone. We can have a single site in your data center. We can have multiple sites. We can distribute erasure codes across multiple sites. And you set these levels of policy on a bucket-to-bucket basis, right? You can also determine and set policy on your consistency level. So lots of flexibility within the system. From a cost perspective, again, I said before, if you want to be able to take costs out of the equation and store as much data as you possibly can, then we're the best answer for that. We are able to store, this is a 10 petabyte example, but we could store 10 petabytes of data with a 5-year cost of 1.6 million. So if you look at that over that 60-month period, that's about a little less than 33% less than Glacier, but our response time is measured in milliseconds, not in hours, right? We're actually 88% less than S3. And you could say, oh, but now I have to store the data, I have to manage that infrastructure, and there's networking cost, and that's all true, but that's not 88% worth, right? That's not many millions of dollars worth, right? So this is, the TCO is about 1/30th the cost when you include that there's no bandwidth cost with what we do here as well. I talked about the S3 API. Again, not everybody's object store is truly compatible with the S3 API. They might do some gets, puts, post, deletes, and basic things. But with Cloudian, you get all the verbs that are available within the API, and you don't have to change your application to have it work on-premise. Again, we're a distributed cluster that's geographically aware. So when the data comes or a request for the data comes into the system, you're never more than one hop away, right? So latency in our architecture or response time to the application, parallels nothing, right? So we're definitely extremely performant, at least for an architecture that can scale to hundreds of petabytes and billions of objects. We also provide encryption. So again, where I talked about security as being really important, encryption both at the client side as well as at the server side, kind of where we do this. So we're able to encrypt data both in flight and at rest. And very important, it allows you to manage the keys yourself. So you can manage the keys in-house and still be able to tier the data out to the public cloud, right? So you want to make sure that you don't send data out to the cloud that isn't pre-encrypted, right? So we provide our customers the ability of controlling the encryption keys inside your firewall, not outside. This is kind of our framework. So I talked a lot about kind of the storage piece, but really at the end of the day, Cloudian allows you to create this data management platform, and that management platform through the S3 API makes us extensible to all other types of applications, right? Including up to Spark, right? If you're doing kind of in-memory analytics, if you're doing things like Elasticsearch, or you're doing log aggregation. If we work with SkyMind, who's signing some books over here, they're utilizing us natively for our S3 API. We extend that API to their application as well. But this is kind of just a logical architecture of how we can take the baseline of a private S3 interface or an API and extend that to all different types of applications. This is an example of how we extend our Cassandra database into Elasticsearch. So again, any of the data that's stored in us, including the metadata, is all extensible directly from us into Elasticsearch, and you're able to essentially scrape the data that's stored within us. And it's a really powerful aspect, being able to index and search all of the data in a single platform that sits inside your firewall. It's just a little bit more on the company. We're kind of a late stage kind of startup at this point, but still continue to grow really fast. Obviously, I just talked about our partnership with Microsoft today, but you'll see a lot more from us in terms of larger partnerships as well. Lastly, this is kind of the summary of what we do and the takeaways that I want from you. is really that this is an on-premises private cloud S3 storage that gives you all the features and functionality of the public cloud, but on-premise at a fraction of the cost. Thank you very much, and appreciate Strata for hosting us today.